Amara Nwosu had 4 minutes left in her wedding, and she still did not know if her husband was going to touch her. She sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than her mother's house, in a room so white it looked bleached, in a dress that had been chosen by someone else for a wedding that had been arranged by no one who loved her. Somewhere past the door, Seoul kept being Seoul, indifferent and glittering. Somewhere past the ocean, her mother lay in a hospital bed hooked to a machine that was the only reason any of this had happened at all. The door opened without a knock. Kang Tae-min stood in it, still in his wedding suit, tie already gone, and for a long moment he simply looked at her the way a man looks at a door he isn't sure he's allowed to walk through. Amara did not flinch. She had spent 3 weeks learning not to flinch. He crossed the room, and for one terrible electric second, she thought she understood exactly what kind of night this was going to be. The internet had already decided what she was worth. The cameras outside the cathedral that afternoon had decided it twice. She braced the way she'd been bracing since she was 9 years old. Then the most feared man in Seoul got down on one knee in front of her on his wedding night and reached, not for her face, not for her dress, for the hem of the shawl she'd pulled protectively over her collarbone. "May I?" he asked. Nobody had asked her that in years. "I'm not going to touch you tonight," he said when she didn't answer. "Or any night you don't ask me to. I need you to hear that before you sleep in this house." What Amara did not know, sitting there with her heart going wild against her ribs, was that in 6 weeks, this man would tear up a contract with his own hands in front of half of Seoul's business elite and call it the smallest thing he'd ever destroyed for her. She did not know that the scar she'd spent a lifetime hiding was about to become the reason a dying old man finally said he was sorry. She had no idea that night that the worst thing anyone had ever called her was about to become the reason the whole country learned her name. But that's getting ahead of things. Rewind 6 weeks to a Tuesday, to a boutique in Itaewon that smelled like steam and starch, where Amara Nwosu was on her knees pinning a hem and trying not to cry. "You can't be here anymore, Mrs." Yoon said. She said it the way she said everything, briskly, like she was reading a receipt. "The clients are asking questions. It's bad for business." "Which clients?" Amara asked, though she already knew. "Mrs." Yoon didn't answer that. She just turned her phone around. The video had 11,000 views by then. It would have 400,000 by the end of the week. Yuri, the boutique's other seamstress, had filmed it 3 days earlier without asking. Amara adjusting a mirror, catching the light wrong, the old burn scar running pale and rope thin from her collarbone up the side of her neck, fully visible for one unguarded second. Someone had captioned it. Someone else had turned the caption into a poll. By Tuesday morning, Seoul's ugliest woman was a phrase that existed, and it had her face attached to it. "I'm not firing you because of the video, Mrs." Yoon said, which was its own kind of lie. "I'm firing you because you're a distraction." Amara set down the pens very carefully because her hands wanted to shake and she would not give the room that. "I've worked here 4 years. I know. I trained under a master tailor in Lagos for 3 of them before that. I can do things with a bias cut that Yuri will never learn. I know that too." Mrs. Yoon didn't quite meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, she wasn't." Amara had learned to hear the difference. She was 3 subway stops from the boutique, staring at nothing out the window, when her phone rang with the number that had been calling every day for a week. Lagos General Renal Unit. She let it go to voicemail twice before she made herself answer. Miss Nwosu, this is regarding your mother's account. The woman on the line was kind, which somehow made it worse. We understand this is difficult, but dialysis 3 times a week isn't something we can continue to provide without payment. We need the balance cleared by Friday, or we'll have to discuss other arrangements. Other arrangements meant her mother's name moving down a list. Amara knew exactly what that meant because she'd watched it happen to a neighbor's father 2 years ago, and she'd sworn on that neighbor's father's grave that it would never happen to Chidinma Nwosu. I'll have it, Amara said, with no idea how that sentence would become true. Her sister called an hour later, 19 years old, and trying to sound braver than she was. Ada, did they call you? About Mummy? They called. I can defer the semester. You will not defer the semester. Amara said it fast, before Ngozi could finish the thought. Their mother had raised 2 daughters alone on a seamstress's wages and a market stall, and the entire architecture of that sacrifice existed so that one day Ngozi would have a degree neither of their parents had been allowed to finish. Amara was not going to be the reason that architecture fell down. I'll handle it. How? That was the question, wasn't it? She was still turning it over 3 hours later, unemployed and jobless scared in a way that made her chest feel too small, when she found the email she'd sent herself 6 months ago in a fit of desperate, half-serious math. Han Matchmaking Consultancy. Discrete arrangements. Compensation negotiable. She'd filled out the intake form on a night when the numbers hadn't worked no matter how she added them, told herself she'd never actually go through with it, and then never deleted the confirmation. The confirmation had a reply now, sitting 3 days old in her inbox, marked urgent. A client requires an expedited introduction. Please come in tomorrow at 11 if you're still interested. Compensation for this arrangement is significant. Amara sat with her thumb over the phone for a long time. Her mother's face rose up in her mind, not sick, not in a hospital bed, but the way she'd looked the day Amara graduated design school in Lagos, proud enough to cry in public, a woman who'd sewn other people's wedding gowns her whole life and never once complained that she'd never worn a fine one herself. Friday, the balance had to clear by Friday. Amara typed back 4 words. I'll be there. She had no idea, sending it, that the man on the other end of that arrangement was currently standing in a boardroom 40 floors above Gangnam, being told by his own grandfather's lawyer that he had 72 hours to find a wife or lose everything his family had spent 3 generations building. She had no idea that in less than a day. A woman who'd never once been unkind to her would call her ugly to her face in front of him, and that instead of agreeing, he would ask her name. The Han Consultancy waiting room looked like a hotel lobby that had given up trying to be warm. Amara sat at the end of a row of 6 women, all of them dressed like they were interviewing for a job no one had told her the terms of. And she understood within about 90 seconds that this was not a normal introduction. You're the one from the video, said the woman 2 seats down, not quite whispering. She had glossy hair and a dress that probably cost Amara's old monthly rent. Right? The ugly one. Suah don't, said the man standing behind her, though he was smiling when he said it, which undid the correction entirely. Amara kept her eyes forward. She had learned, over the last 3 days, that if she didn't react, cruelty tended to get bored and go looking for a bigger reaction somewhere else. It rarely worked. It was, at least, something to do with her hands. I just think it's funny, so went on, to the man beside her, loud enough to carry. That Mrs. Han's assistant let her onto the list at all. Someone thought it would be a joke, Min Jun. You have to admit it's a good one. Kang Tae Min, forced to choose a wife off a list, and there she is. Min Jun didn't laugh, but he didn't stop her either. He just checked his watch. The particular stillness of a man enjoying something he wasn't allowed to enjoy openly. Amara understood, distantly, that she was not actually the joke. She was a prop in someone else's joke, aimed at a man she hadn't met yet. It didn't make it hurt less. It made it hurt in a stranger, colder place. The place that had learned, a long time ago, that the world would always find new reasons to look at her scar before it looked at her face. The door at the end of the hall opened, and the temperature of the room changed before anyone said a word. He didn't look like a man who needed to be introduced. He looked like a man who had never once in his life had to raise his voice to be heard. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of stillness that read less like calm and more like something coiled. Every woman in that waiting room sat up half an inch without appearing to move at all. Kang Tae Min murmured the woman beside Amara like a prayer or a warning. You do know who that is? Amara didn't, not really, not yet. Mrs. Han appeared at his elbow, flustered in a way that suggested this meeting was moving faster than she'd planned for. Mr. Kang, if you'll give me a moment to walk you through the candidates. I don't have a moment, he said. Not unkind, just true. I have 71 hours. Sua stepped forward like she'd been waiting for a cue. Well, you should at least know which ones to skip. She tilted her head toward Amara without quite looking at her, the way you gesture at a stain. That one went viral this week. They're calling her the ugliest woman in Seoul. I only say it because I'd hate for you to be embarrassed. The room went very quiet. Amara did not look down. She had promised herself somewhere on the subway that whatever happened in this room, she would not look down. Kang Tae Min looked at Sua for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at Amara, and something in his face reorganized itself, quiet and total, like a door closing on a conversation that had bored him. What's your name? He asked her. Only her. Amara Nuosu. Amara Nosu, he repeated, like he was filing it somewhere permanent. He didn't ask about the video. He didn't ask about the scar. He turned to Mrs. Han instead. I'd like to speak with Miss Nuosu alone. Sua's mouth opened and then closed, and for one bright, ugly second, Amara let herself enjoy it. The office they gave them was small and glass-walled, and he sat across from her like a man used to negotiations, which she supposed he was. I'll be direct, he said. My grandfather's will requires I marry before my 33rd birthday, or my cousin becomes chairman of Kane Group. He would use that position to unwind 10 years of work I've done pulling this company out of businesses I'm not proud we were ever in. I have 3 days. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me. I'm asking for 1 year, a legal marriage, separate lives inside the same house, and compensation you can name yourself. Amara's pulse was loud in her own ears. Why me? You don't know you. Because in that room just now, 6 women looked at you like you were something to step around. His jaw was very still. and you didn't move. She thought of Friday. She thought of a machine keeping her mother's blood clean 3 times a week and a balance that needed clearing before the sun went down on it. I need it in writing, she said. Everything. And I need the first payment before Friday. Done, Kang Tae-min said, like it cost him nothing, though later she'd learn nothing about him ever came that easy. He'd simply already decided. Mrs. Han caught her in the hallway on the way out, gripping her arm with more urgency than the moment seemed to call for. You said yes. I said I'd think about it. Amara, Mrs. Han lowered her voice. They call him the ICE CEO. Some people say worse than that the company built half its early fortune on money nobody asks questions about. I don't know how much of it is true. I know he has never once, in 3 years of doing business with this agency, looked twice at anyone in that room. She glanced back toward the glass office. Until today. Amara looked down at the card in her hand, at a number that would clear her mother's balance twice over, and thought about the particular quality of his stillness when he'd said, "You didn't move." She had 6 weeks left of freedom to think it over. She used 4 days. The terms meeting happened in a private dining room 2 nights later. And it was, Amara would think, afterward. The strangest negotiation of her life, conducted over untouched tea between 2 people who had met exactly once. One, she said, sliding a folded page across the table. You never discuss my appearance or that video with me or in front of me for any reason. Agreed, too. My salary is paid directly to an account in Lagos in full on the 1st of every month, regardless of what happens between us. Agreed. I'll have my accountant set it up tomorrow. 3. Separate bedrooms. This is a business arrangement. I don't want it pretending to be anything else behind closed doors. For the first time, he paused. Agreed, he said, and something in the pause told her he'd expected to have to fight her for it, and was relieved not to. 4. When the year is over, we file for annulment, no contest, no press, and I walk away with my name and my life. Agreed, he turned the page around, added a line in neat economical handwriting, and slid it back. In the event of any threat to Miss Nwosu's safety or family, all resources of Kang Group are available to her without condition. Amara read it twice. I didn't ask for that. I know, Kang Tae-min said. I'm adding it anyway. She signed the contract 2 days after that, in a lawyer's office that smelled like new carpet, and felt the strange, hollow relief of watching a number appear in her mother's account an hour later. The machine that kept her mother alive, guaranteed, for the first time in months, past Friday. She had no idea, signing her name under his, that she'd just signed the first draft of the truest thing that would ever happen to her. Choi Woo-jin met her at the elevator on her way out, broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed, the kind of calm that came from having handled worse days than this one. Miss Nwosu, he said with a small, correct bow. I'll be arranging your security detail. If you need anything, day or night, you call me before you call him. Why would I need a security detail? Choi's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Because of who he is, he said simply. And because, starting Saturday, of who you'll be too. Saturday came faster than Amara was ready for. The cathedral had been chosen by the Kang family lawyers, not for beauty, but for optics. Old stone, high enough ceilings to swallow a scandal, and by the time Amara arrived, there were more photographers outside than guests inside. She understood why within the first 10 minutes. Someone, and she didn't have to guess who, had leaked the wedding to 3 tabloids the night before, with a headline already written for them: the Kang heir marrying the woman the internet had voted ugliest in Seoul. Her mother watched the live stream from a hospital bed 8,000 miles away, because there hadn't been time or money to fly her out, and Amara held on to that image. Her mother, alive, watching, through every whisper that followed her down the aisle. She heard them. She was meant to hear them. Is that really her? I heard he lost a bet. Poor thing, she has no idea what she married into. King Tae-min stood at the altar in a black suit, utterly still, and when she reached him, he did something none of the whispering guests expected. He reached out, before the officiant had said a word, and moved her veil half an inch to the left so it framed her face instead of hiding it. "Don't hide," he murmured, low enough only for her. "Not today, not for them." It was the first kindness anyone outside her own family had offered her in 3 days, and it nearly broke the composure she'd spent a lifetime building. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows neither of them meant yet, and rings that felt too heavy for what they represented. The reception was worse. Cold champagne and colder smiles, Sua's laugh carrying 2 tables too far. A photographer catching Amara alone at one point and murmuring, just loud enough, "Give us something real, not the fake bride face," until Kang Tae-min appeared at her elbow out of nowhere, and the photographer suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. By the time they reached the penthouse that night, Amara was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her feet, which brought her back to the beginning, to a bed too white, a shawl pulled tight over her collarbone, and a man on one knee asking permission for something as small as touching fabric. "Does it still hurt?" he asked, when she let him see it properly for the first time, not the whole story, just the ridge of scar tissue catching the lamplight. Not anymore. Amara found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to tell him. "I was 9. My sister was 2. There was a fire, a gas stove, our kitchen. I got her out first. I went back in for our mother's sewing machine, because it was the only thing she owned that mattered, and the ceiling came down while I was under the table." She touched the scar without thinking. Everyone in my old neighborhood called it my superhero mark. Then I moved here, and it became a joke instead. Kang Tae-min was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone rougher than she'd heard it. "You ran back into a fire for a sewing machine." "For my mother's hands," Amara corrected. "The machine was just how she used them." Something crossed his face then, not pity, which she'd have refused, but something closer to recognition, like he'd just met someone who understood a particular kind of debt he also carried and had never said aloud. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood, drew the blanket up over the foot of the bed, and paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people who wanted something from me. Tonight was the first time in 3 years I wanted to stay in one longer than I had to." He left before she could answer. Amara sat alone in the too white room for a long time afterward, one hand pressed flat over her own scar, feeling something crack open in her chest that she did not yet have a name for either. The weeks after the wedding blurred together, the way weeks do when you're too busy surviving them to notice them passing. Amara learned the penthouse's rhythms, the elevator that required a code, the kitchen so pristine it looked unused. The steady Kang Tae-min disappeared into most nights until well past midnight. She learned that Choi Woo-jin kept a running mental list of every driver, every entrance, every threat, real or imagined, and that once, catching her watching a Korean drama in the sitting room, he'd stood in the doorway for 11 full minutes before pretending he'd only stopped for water. "You could just watch it with me," Amara said, without turning around. "I have work." "You've had that folder under your arm for 11 minutes and you haven't opened it once." He didn't answer that. But the next night, he sat down at the far end of the couch, folder unopened on his lap, and stayed for the whole episode without saying a single word. Ngozi caught the whole story 2 days later over video call and shrieked loud enough that Amara had to mute her own volume. He watched a whole episode of a K-drama and didn't complain? Ada, that man is gone. That man is finished. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. Ngozi grinned, all 19 years of unearned confidence. "I watch these shows. Remember, I know how this one goes. Cold rich man, sad backstory, cooks nothing for himself. One homemade meal from home and he's never the same again." Amara laughed despite herself, and then found herself, 3 nights later, standing in that too pristine kitchen with a bag of dried crayfish and palm oil choy had somehow sourced from a Nigerian grocer 2 districts over, cooking jollof rice for the first time since she'd left Lagos. She wasn't cooking it for him. She told herself that twice while she cooked it. He came home earlier than she expected. She heard the elevator, then his footsteps slow in the hallway, drawn by a smell that had no business being in that apartment. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his shirt sleeves, tie already loosened, and went very still. "What is that?" "Jollof rice. And egusi soup. It's not going to be as good as my mother's. I don't have half the right ingredients, but can I try it?" She hadn't expected him to ask so plainly. She served him a small bowl, half braced for polite disinterest, and watched him take the first bite the way she imagined a man might approach a bomb, carefully, like it might do something to him he couldn't take back. Something did. His shoulders dropped half an inch. His eyes closed, briefly, and when they opened again, there was a look on his face she hadn't seen there before. Something almost boyish under all that ice. "This is," he stopped, took a second bite before finishing the sentence, which told her more than the sentence itself would. "This is the best thing I've eaten in 3 years. You're exaggerating. I don't exaggerate. Ask anyone." He took a third bite, and then, almost against his own will, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but close enough that Amara found herself staring at it longer than was strictly necessary. Almost a smile. "Almost, there's more if you want it," she said. "I want it." He came home early for dinner 4 nights that week. By the 5th, Choi had quietly started stocking the kitchen with palm oil without being asked, and Amara pretended not to notice that the man who ran a company with thousands of employees had started rearranging his schedule around a pot of soup. It was Sua who found a way to make even that feel dangerous. She appeared at Kane Group's headquarters on a Thursday, uninvited, trailing perfume and a photographer she'd clearly brought on purpose, and cornered Amara in the lobby with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Look at you," Sua said. "Playing house. It's almost sweet, in a sad way. You know none of this is real, don't you? A year, and then he throws you back." "I know the terms of my own marriage," Amara said, evenly. "Do you know the terms of yours?" Sua's smile flickered, just slightly, And Amara understood she'd landed somewhere true, that whatever arrangement bound Suwa to Minjun wasn't as solid as she wanted it to look either. Enjoy the fairy tale while it lasts, Suwa said, recovering, turning to go. Cinderella's clock always strikes midnight eventually. Amara watched her leave and found, to her own surprise, that the words didn't land where they were meant to. Something had shifted in her over these weeks in ways she was only beginning to notice. She wasn't just surviving this marriage anymore. She was starting, quietly, dangerously, to want it. The Kane Group Foundation Gala fell on the 8-week mark, and it was, everyone agreed later, the night everything changed, though not in the way anyone standing in that ballroom expected. Amara wore green that night, a color she'd chosen herself against her stylist's advice, and stood at Kang Tae-min's side through an hour of handshakes and careful smiles before Chairman Kang Joon-ho's oldest friend. A board member's wife with too much champagne in her, leaned over with a laugh that wasn't kind. "So you're the one," the woman said, looking Amara over like a piece of furniture. "I have to ask, how much does it cost exactly to be decoration for a man like that?" "I've always wondered what the going rate is for foreign girls these days." The ballroom didn't go silent, not exactly, but the nearest cluster of guests turned, sensing blood. Amara felt the old familiar heat climb her throat, and then, deliberately, let it go. She thought of her mother's hands on a sewing machine. She thought of a scar that had once saved a life. "I'm not decoration," she said, calm, clear, pitched to carry. "I trained for 6 years to cut a garment that fits a body most designers won't even look at twice. I've kept my mother alive on a seamstress's salary since I was 17. And I've been called worse than foreign girl by people with better manners than you, so you'll forgive me if it doesn't land." The silence that followed had a different texture entirely. Kang Tae-min set down his glass. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. But every person near enough to hear him felt the temperature in that half of the room drop. "Mrs. Kang doesn't owe anyone in this room an explanation for existing," he said. "But you owe her an apology before I decide whether you're still welcome at this foundation's events." The woman went pale and stammered something that might have been sorry. Amara barely heard it. She was too busy watching her husband defend her in public for the first time, unasked, unrehearsed, like it hadn't even occurred to him not to. Later, on the terrace, away from the noise, he told her about his parents for the first time. The car that had never been an accident. The men his grandfather still wouldn't name. The 19-year-old who'd had to learn overnight how to run a company built half on legitimate ambition and half on things he was still trying to unwind 10 years later. "I stopped letting people close after that," he said, looking out at the skyline instead of at her. "It seemed safer. Nobody can use what you don't let them see. And now I bring work folders into rooms just so I have a reason to sit near you," he said, and it was as close to a confession as either of them had gotten. "I don't know what to do with that." Amara didn't either. She was, if she was honest with herself, and she made herself be honest, standing there in the cold night air, very good at lying to herself about exactly how much she'd started to feel. It was easier not to look directly at it. Some things, looked at too soon, had a way of shattering before they'd finished forming. She looked at it anyway, just for a moment, standing beside him on that terrace. And what she found there frightened her far more than any headline ever had. The late-night kitchen became theirs, without either of them deciding it. Some nights it was jollof rice, other nights it was nothing at all, just tea going cold while they talked until 2 in the morning about nothing that mattered and everything that did, her design sketches, spread across the counter. His questions about fabric weight and drape that were really questions about her. "You should have your own label," he said one night, turning one of her sketchbooks toward the light. "This isn't a hobby. This is a body of work." "It's a hobby that pays no bills," Amara said. "I have exactly one contract paying my bills, and it expires in 10 months. He didn't answer that, and something in his silence felt like it cost him something. It was on one of those nights, close to midnight, that he reached across the counter and tucked a loose braid behind her ear, and neither of them moved for a long moment afterward. Amara, her name in his mouth, sounded like something he'd been saving. "If I asked to kiss you right now, what would you say?" Her heart was loud enough that she was sure he could hear it. "Ask me and find out." "Can I kiss you?" "Not yet," she heard herself say, and watched something in his face brace for disappointment before she finished. "But soon. I need it to be real when it happens. Not something we half fall into on a Tuesday." He nodded, slow, and something like relief crossed his face rather than hurt, like he'd wanted the same caution and hadn't known how to ask for it. Soon, he agreed. It was, Amara would think later, the safest either of them had felt in weeks. Which was exactly when the first crack appeared. It arrived as an unfamiliar number, a single text, sent to Amara's phone at 11 at night. "Ask your husband what happened to the last woman who got close to him. Ask him what his cousin knows that he doesn't." She didn't sleep that night. She didn't show it to him either, not yet, some instinct telling her to wait, to understand it before she handed it to him. 2 days later, a courier delivered an envelope to the penthouse addressed to no one, containing photographs, long lens, grainy, clearly taken without either of their knowledge, of Amara and Kang Tae-min on the terrace the night of the gala, and of her, alone, meeting Mrs. Han weeks earlier, before the wedding, before any of this had a name. Choi Woo-jin's face, when she showed him, told her everything she needed to know about how serious it was. "Someone's building a file," he said. "This isn't random. Someone wants a story they can sell later, that this marriage was fake from before the wedding even happened." Who? Choi didn't answer immediately, and that silence was its own kind of answer. It was Amara who finally connected the pieces 2 nights later, half by accident, overhearing a name in a phone call Kang Tae-min took too tensely in his study, Director Bayek, a name she recognized from the boardroom photos on the office wall. One of the company's most senior directors, a man Kang Tae-min had trusted since he was 19 years old and terrified and freshly orphaned. "Bake's been feeding information to my cousin for months," Kang Tae-min told her that night, jaw tight in a way she'd never seen. "Financials, schedules, I don't know how much yet. I trusted him with everything after my parents died. He was the only one who didn't treat me like a child playing chairman. What does Min Jun want with it?" "Leverage," he looked at her, and something in his face had gone careful, protective, afraid. 3 things she'd never seen stacked together on him at once. "I think he's going to try to prove this marriage was never real. If he can convince the board it was a business arrangement designed to steal a chairmanship, he doesn't just get the company. He gets to have you deported for marriage fraud and me removed for orchestrating it." Amara felt the floor tilt slightly under her. Can he do that? Not if I have anything left to say about it, Kang Tae-min said. But for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something under his certainty that sounded almost like fear. They moved her mother's dialysis payments to a private account that week, on Choi's advice, routed through channels harder to trace. They doubled security at the penthouse. Amara stopped taking calls from unknown numbers, stopped walking to the market alone, felt, for the first time since the wedding, like the walls of the life they'd built together were made of something thinner than she'd let herself believe. She had no idea, lying awake that night beside a man she was no longer pretending not to love, that the worst of it hadn't even started yet. The blow landed on a Tuesday, which Amara would remember afterward as an unbearably ordinary detail for the worst day of her life. She was called into an emergency board session she hadn't been warned about, into a room full of directors she barely knew, and found Chairman Kang Joon-ho at the head of the table with a folder in front of him and an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not cold. Exactly. Something worse. Betrayed. Sit down, Mrs. Kang, he said. It was the first time he'd used her married name, and it didn't sound like a kindness. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were documents, a bank transfer, dated weeks before the wedding, showing a payment from an account linked to a rival syndicate into an account that bore her name. Badly forged, but convincing enough at a glance. A photograph, doctored just enough, of her meeting a stranger in a coat she'd never owned, time-stamped the week before the proposal. This says you were paid to marry my grandson, the chairman said. Paid, before you ever met him, to marry into this family and gather information for people who have wanted to destroy what we've built for 30 years. That's not, Amara's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands in her lap had gone cold. That's not true. Any of it. I've never seen that account. That photograph isn't even a coat I own. It's remarkably convincing for something that isn't true. Grandfather, Kang Tae-min, was on his feet before she'd finished. You know this is Min Jun's handwriting all over it. Baek's been feeding him information for months. We have proof of that much already. I know you love her, Chairman Kang said. And there was real grief in it, which made it worse. I know that's why you can't see this clearly. I loved your grandmother that way once too. It didn't stop Min from using her against me. Then trust me when I tell you she is not one of those men's tools. I can't afford to trust anyone right now. The chairman's voice cracked just once on the word afford, and Amara understood, distantly, underneath her own fear, that this was a frightened old man clutching the only thing he had left to protect, a company built on his son's grave. Until this is resolved, the board is recommending the marriage be suspended, pending investigation. Mrs. Nwosu will need to vacate the residence. Nwosu, not Kang. He'd already taken it back from her. Amara did not cry in that boardroom. She would allow herself that later, alone, she stood, gathered what dignity she had left in her hands, like a coat too thin for the weather outside, and said, I understand, though she understood nothing at all, except that the ground had opened underneath the only life she'd let herself want in years. Kang Tae-min followed her out into the hallway, furious, torn in half between the grandfather who'd raised him and the wife the whole boardroom had just called a liar. Amara, I don't believe any of it. You have to know that. Then why, she said, and her voice finally broke on it, Didn't you stop them? He didn't have an answer fast enough. That was the part that hurt worst. Not the folder, not the forged photograph, not even the chairman's grief-soaked accusation. It was the half second of silence from the one person who was supposed to be certain. That night, the hospital in Lagos called. Her mother's account had been frozen, automatically pending the investigation into the source of her funds, and the dialysis center was, once again, asking about Friday. Amara packed a single suitcase in the guest room she'd been given 8 weeks ago on her wedding night, the same room, the same white walls, and sat on the edge of that same bed and understood, for the first time since she'd said yes to Mrs. Han's email, exactly how completely a life could be taken from a person who had done nothing to deserve losing it. She had run into a fire once for a sewing machine. She had not expected at 28 to be burned by a family for a marriage she'd never once used as anything but shelter for the people she loved. She did not cry until the door was closed. Then she let herself for exactly 1 hour because there wasn't time to spend on it after that. Amara did not run. She sat with that thought until it stopped shaking, somewhere around 3 in the morning, and by 4, she had made a decision that surprised her more than it should have. She was not going to disappear quietly back to Lagos and let a lie be the last word anyone in that boardroom ever said about her. Choi Woo-jin arrived before dawn without being asked, standing in the doorway of the guest room like a man who'd already made up his mind about which side of this he was on. "I have something you need to see," he said. What he had was 3 months of security footage he'd quietly been archiving since the surveillance photos first appeared. Footage of Director Bayek meeting Kang Min-jun in a parking structure twice a week, of documents changing hands, and buried in an audio file Choi had never been authorized to record, but had anyway, Baek's own voice, agreeing to fabricate a financial trail linking Amara to a payment that never existed. "Why do you have this?" Amara asked. "Because your husband asked me 8 weeks ago to protect what mattered to him," Choi said. "I decided that included you before he'd said the words out loud." It wasn't enough on its own. Amara knew that. A recording could be dismissed as edited, staged, one more fabrication in a war of fabrications. But as she sat with the footage playing on Choi's tablet, something else caught her eye in the frame behind Bayek and Min-jun, a garment bag hanging in the back seat of Min-jun's car, visible in one grainy frame for less than 2 seconds. She paused it, zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. "That's a Kang Group courier bag," she said slowly. "That's the same fabric weight they use for board documents. If Baek printed the forged transfer records on company stock, there'll be a paper trail in procurement no one thought to check, because no one thinks to check paper." Choi looked at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You can tell that from a 2-second frame of fabric?" "I've spent 6 years learning to read cloth for a living," Amara said. "It's the only language nobody's ever managed to lie to me in." By morning, Choi had the procurement records. By noon, they had a name, a date, and a printer log that placed the forged documents in Director Baek's office 2 full weeks before Amara had even signed her marriage contract, proof the fraud predated the very crime it was meant to accuse her of. The emergency shareholders meeting was scheduled for 4 o'clock that afternoon, called by Kang Min-jun himself, confident enough in his forged folder to move for an immediate vote on interim leadership. Amara arrived 20 minutes early, alone, and asked the board secretary for 5 minutes on the agenda. She was denied twice before Chairman Kang Joon-ho, sitting gray-faced at the head of the table, overruled his own secretary with a single tired word. Let her speak. Every head in that room turned as Amara walked to the front, spine straight, scar uncovered, for the first time in a room like this on purpose, and set a folder down that was, this time, entirely true. 8 weeks ago, she said, this family called me the ugliest woman in Seoul before they knew my name. Yesterday, this board called me a liar and a spy before you checked a single document I'm about to show you. I'd like 5 minutes to correct both. She played the recording. She showed the procurement timestamps. She watched Kang Min-jun's face go from smug to gray to something close to panic as the room turned on him, one director at a time. This is fabricated, Min-jun said. Too loud, too fast. She's had time to prepare this. Of course it looks convincing. The printer log is dated 2 weeks before my wedding. Min-jun, Amara said, quiet and absolutely unshaken. I didn't have a printer log 2 weeks before my wedding. I had a job I'd just been fired from and a mother on dialysis. You had motive, access, and Director Bake's very cooperative confession, which he gave Mr. Choi voluntarily this morning once he understood how much prison time forgery carries when it's used against a shareholder vote. Director Baek, sitting 3 seats down, did not deny it. He put his face in his hands instead, which was its own confession. Chairman Kang Joon-ho rose slowly from his chair, older in that moment than Amara had ever seen him look, and crossed the room to stand in front of her. I called you a liar in front of this board, he said. His voice shook, just slightly. I did it because I was afraid of losing this company the way I lost my son. Afraid that loving someone always ends the same way in this family. I let that fear make me cruel to the one person who's made my grandson smile in 10 years. He bowed, formally, deeply, in front of the entire board. I am sorry, Mrs. Kang, deeply, truly sorry. Kang Min-jun was escorted out 20 minutes later, stripped by unanimous board vote of every title he held, reassigned, at the chairman's insistence, in lieu of the criminal referral he clearly deserved to manage the company's smallest, least profitable regional office, 400 kilometers away in Busan. So-ah's engagement announcement was quietly deleted from every society page by sundown. Kang Tae-min found Amara in the empty boardroom afterward, the folder still open on the table between them, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. I should have defended you faster, he said finally. In that first meeting, I hesitated, and it cost you something I can't give back. You're giving it back right now, Amara said. He reached into his jacket and drew out the marriage contract. The real one, the one with her 4 terms and his added line about her safety. The one that had started this whole thing as a business transaction with an expiration date. He tore it in half, slowly, deliberately, in front of her. I don't want a contract with you anymore, he said. I want a marriage, a real one, no deadline, no annulment clause. Just you, if you'll still have me, for reasons that have nothing to do with a will. Can I kiss you? Amara asked, before he could ask her. Something in his face broke open, warm and unguarded, the closest thing to a real smile she'd ever seen on him. Please, he kissed her slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, and she didn't take a single one of them. 1 year later, the garden behind the Kang family estate was full of white and gold, and Amara Nwosu stood in a wedding dress she had designed and sewn herself, waiting to marry the same man for the second time. This time, for no reason except that she wanted to. Her mother sat in the front row, upright, steady, 2 years post-transplant, and stronger than Amara had seen her since childhood, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief Amara had embroidered herself. Ngozi stood beside her, a university graduate now, narrating the whole ceremony under her breath to anyone near enough to listen, as though she still couldn't quite believe her sister's life had turned into the very drama she used to watch on Sunday afternoons. Halmoni Jung, who had run the Kang household since before Kang Tae-min was born, pressed a small, worn envelope into Amara's hands just before the ceremony began. "Your husband's mother wrote this the year before she died," the old woman said, eyes wet. She said, "Keep it until he finds someone worth loving properly. And give it to her, not to him. I've been waiting 11 years to give this to somebody." Amara opened it after the vows, alone for a moment on the terrace while the reception gathered itself below. The handwriting was careful, warm, unmistakably a mother's. "I don't know who you are yet. I only know that whoever loves my son enough to wait for the ice to melt deserves to know he was always warm underneath it, even when the world convinced him to hide it. Thank you for finding him. I knew, somehow, that someone would." Amara pressed the letter to her chest and let herself cry. Finally, fully, the good kind of tears. Mwosu House had opened its doors 6 months earlier, a small atelier in Itaewon 2 blocks from the boutique that had once fired her, where Amara now designed garments that folded Nigerian textiles into Korean tailoring with a precision no one in the city could quite replicate. A celebrity had worn one of her pieces to a film premiere in the spring. The waiting list now ran 4 months long. Kang Group's investment had gotten her the lease. Her own 2 hands had done the rest. Kang Min Jun sent a card from Busan that year, brief and stiff, congratulating his cousin on the wedding. Nobody framed it. Nobody needed to. Kang Tae-min found her on the terrace, took her hand, and led her back down to the garden where their families were waiting. Hers from Lagos, his from Seoul. 2 rooms that had never been meant to sit at the same table, laughing together now like they'd always belonged there. It wasn't the wedding the tabloids had once mocked. It wasn't a transaction, wasn't a contract, wasn't a bargain struck to save a company or a mother's life. It was smaller than that, and so much bigger. Not perfect, but real. Not chosen for her, but chosen by her. Not the ugliest woman in Seoul, but Amara Nwosu, a name that, she finally understood, standing in that garden with her mother's hand in one of hers and her husband's in the other, had always meant grace, and had finally found a life brave enough to hold it. Thank you for staying with Amara and Tae-min all the way to the end. If you felt every second of what it cost her to walk into that boardroom and hand the truth to people who'd already decided who she was, I made this one for you. Tell me down in the comments, when she zoomed in on that 2-second frame of fabric, did you already know she'd be the one to save herself? And if stories about women who get called the worst thing in the room and answer it with dignity instead of despair are your kind of thing, subscribe so the next one finds you. Some of the best families and the best marriages are the ones we choose twice. I'll see you in the next one.